So if you guys just want to introduce yourselves.
Yes, my name is Keith Knight. I run a YouTube channel, Keith Knight, Don't Tread on Anyone. I attempt to advocate libertarian anarchism or voluntarism or anarcho-capitalism, basically the non-aggression principle and the self-defense principle. That is, in short, what I do. I'll give my opening statement after Brent introduces himself.
Yeah, hey, okay, I got that working finally. Yeah, so my name is Brent Lengel. I am a poet, playwright. I'm actually one of the last yippies from the Youth International Party that you'll ever meet. I was very active in Occupy Wall Street. I had an anarchist radio show for a year called Insurrection with Brent Lengel. And yeah, I'm all around. I'm primarily a fiction author, but I'm also a political thinker and I love to argue. So very happy and very excited to be here.
Awesome.
So basically, the anarcho-capitalist position is there are two ways anyone can achieve their ends in the world, through voluntarism or violence. Now, this is basically in the definition of capitalism being a social system of the explicit recognition of private property and non-aggressive contractual exchanges between private property owners. In other words, with regard to others, individuals own themselves and any property they own and have the right to exclude others from, assuming they have acquired it through voluntary exchange, contract, or original appropriation. I believe this social system is morally superior because it respects the individual. It does not give one group of people called the state or the slave owners any special rights that no other person has. That is why the anarchist part is complementary to the capitalist part. People do have, I believe, the right to contract, exchange, even if this does result in, say, inequalities. There are also inequalities in singing voices, in writing abilities, in painting abilities, in knowledge. So even though those inequalities may arise, they do not necessarily violate a principle of non-aggression insofar as they don't initiate violence against peaceful people. That is my philosophy. In short, I oppose socialism because it is the institutionalized aggression against private property and private property claims. And I also oppose communism as defined by Karl Marx, the abolition of private property, because I don't believe it respects the individual. I do believe it initiates violence against peaceful people.
Brent?
Yeah, so I don't usually like to get bogged down with labels, but I am an anarchist, or at least I've claimed that label before. And when I first was getting into anarchism, I really wanted to make sure that I understood it. So I went into the history of anarchism and read about the classical anarchists. The anarchist movement has been around politically since Pierre-Joseph Proudhon, who was is a major French thinker. And in fact, one of the most famous quotes from him is "Property is theft." Anarchism philosophically and politically kind of breaks off from a fight between essentially Thomas Hobbes and Rousseau. Hobbes is kind of the basis for a lot of our modern liberal democracies that we're living in right now. And he believed that the state of nature was, life was nasty, brutish, and short. It was a war of all against all. I am much more I much more follow the Rousseauan school, where Rousseau essentially said, no, the problem is not the state of nature. The problem is when man set down a fence and said, this is mine and this is yours and you've got to stay over there. I think that classical anarchism then grew out. Originally, the anarchists were part of the First International, along with the IWA, along with the communists and the Marxists. And then there was a rupture between the anarchists and the Marxists that goes back to a thinker named Mikhail Bakunin. Also, Proudhon and Marx got into a big fight. Proudhon actually did predict a lot of the problems that Marx would have, but the funny thing about it is the whole fight was over book publishing rights. So it was kind of stupid. Anyway, that caused the split, and the anarchists went the more Bakuninite route, and the Marxists went very much what eventually became the USSR. So in a way, you could view anarchists as the cousins of what most people consider communists, but we don't exactly get along. Otto von Bismarck actually famously said that the crowned heads of Europe will quake with fear if ever the black and red once again unite. The type of anarchism that I find most closest to my heart, and we can get into why I believe this later, is probably classical anarcho-syndicalism or anarcho-communism. This grew out of the Bakunin side of the split, and it took root in two major places. One was the Ukraine, with the Ukraine Free State and Nestor Makhno, who ran the Black Army during the Russian Revolution. And he fought both the communists and the royalists, so the Red and the White Army, on behalf of the common man. He was later betrayed by the Red Army after entering into an alliance with them and destroying the Whites once and for all, and had to flee to France. From there we go to Spain, and when Spain's military went fascist under Francisco Franco, there was already a strong current of anarchism in that area. An anarchist by the name of Buenaventura Durruti, who was both a bank robber, kind of a Robin Hood figure, took up defense of the city, defeated the military, one of the only times that civilian forces ever defeated a modern mechanized army, and ran the entire city of Barcelona on an anarcho-communist, anarcho-syndicalist platform for about 3 years. And then they were suppressed by, again, their supposed allies, the Bolsheviks, and then the Bolsheviks backed the Spanish Republic, stole all the gold from Spain, and then got around to promptly losing the war to the fascists. So anarchism, you know, you see it in a lot of ways and in a lot of places throughout history. The Zapatistas in Chiapas, Mexico, and most recently the PKK-YPG in Rojava, and has been doing amazing fighting ISIS. And in fact, they used to be tankies. They used to be the authoritarian kind of communist, but after their leader was imprisoned, he encountered the works of anarcho-communist thinker Maury Bookchin, and began to build a new society based upon what he called democratic confederalism. I may have said that slightly wrong. But so this is essentially the historical understanding of what anarchism has been throughout the years. I would say philosophically, anarchist, I was asked to do like explain anarchism in 5 minutes, or I'm sorry, 30 seconds for Al Jazeera. And I used a variation on Noam Chomsky's definition, which is that anarchism is the belief that those who demand hierarchical privileges for themselves or others must prove their claim. The burden of proof rests upon those who said, I should be your boss, I should be your king, I should be your president, whatever. And if they cannot prove that that claim is valid and necessary, then their authority should be dismantled via direct action, direct democracy, the will of the people, if necessary, revolution. Now, in this thing we were talking about capitalism, the early anarchists were very, very opposed to capitalism because it puts the capitalist class in charge. Specifically, the class is mobile. It's not a formal class, but it is everyone who owns major productive property. And the big problem with that is when you own something that you do not use yourself and do not possess yourself, you gain a great deal of power over someone else, especially if they're the ones that operate it. So if you are renting from me and I own your house that your family lives in, that gives me a huge amount of leverage over you. Similarly, if the way you earn a living in your workplace, if I own that company, again, I can take away your way of living very, very easily just on my whim. And so that gives me an inordinate amount of both formal and informal power. Anarchists have been traditionally opposed to the state because the state is essentially the iron hand behind the iron fist behind the invisible hand. It is the force that keeps these particular social property norms in place. And as long as these norms remain in place, you have people rising to positions of authority that cannot be justified, and in fact are highly dangerous to themselves and others. And now that we've got nuclear weapons and we're having to deal with global warming, like, we actually are at a point where humans can destroy the entire planet as we know it. And so I kind of look at that and I say, that's really a bad idea. And the best way to deal with this issue of individuals rising to these ridiculous heights of power is to destroy the ability to rise to them. I don't think like you think about monarchy. I don't feel that it's a good idea to have a king, even if that king is a benevolent king. Dictatorship. It's not a good idea to have a dictator, even if he's a benevolent dictator. And similarly, you can get into it may not be a good idea to have a boss or a board of directors, no matter how they act, simply because of the precedent that creates, and the point to where one person's very foolish decisions can endanger 7 billion people and countless other species. So I would say that's where I'm coming from.
Brent, would you say you're also against the initiation of force? Or how do you, what do you think about that?
I would say regularly it's a bad idea to attack somebody for no reason, or even to attack somebody for bad reasons. I'm more consequentialist in my approach to philosophy. I think it is valid to initiate force in the event that it prevents a greater tragedy. That's a difficult line to walk. It's a very it's a hard needle to thread, but sometimes it has to be done.
Can I ask you this question?
Yeah.
Like, what if someone wants to work for someone else?
Mm-hmm.
How do you prevent that exactly?
I mean, you don't prevent that. If someone wants to work for someone else, if they genuinely want to do that, I don't see that as a problem, even if it's an abusive relationship. There's always going to be cults. There's always going to be people who want to be a sub, not just in the bedroom, but in real life. And there's always going to be charlatans. And also there's always going to be times that people will rationally follow someone else. That's not the problem. The problem is when you have an entire system built to encourage people to choose to work for someone else. Whereas, like, if I own the only business in town and you kind of have to accept work for me under the terms that I set, and if you don't, you stand a very good chance of getting evicted, being unable to feed yourself, and you'll die either of exposure or starvation or sickness if you do not receive these kinds of things that society needs to provide. That's not a free choice. I mean, you can say that it's a free choice because the person signs on the dotted line, and technically they don't. But it's like a video game where you've got your sandbox video game, but then the designers have it set to where you can't go that way, and you can't go that way, and so you go exactly in the place that you go down the path that they want you to choose. The idea of controlling someone not by applying direct force, but by manipulating the environment so they make the choice you already decided they should make.
Perfect. I think that's a great place for Keith to jump in. What do you think about that?
So, yes, I am very familiar with manipulating consent, people being in extreme positions of vulnerability. So the anarcho-capitalist just sees, first of all, as far as the boss goes, I am totally open to bosses being something old and a ridiculous superstition that no one needs, and we could have worker cooperatives. That's why in the definition of capitalism, it's focused on private property and voluntary exchange. That does not mean money, bosses, banks, guy with a monocle and a hat. It just means respecting self-ownership and any contracts or property that are acquired through voluntary exchange. I'm a big supporter of, say, Epicurean communes. I'm speaking with a Waco survivor later today. I'm a huge supporter of those voluntary communes. I think people have yielded a lot of results from them in a positive way, so I'm totally open to it. The example of there being only one buyer of employer. So I see that as, yes, that is indirect force. However, I don't believe there is a justification to forcibly stop that person from being employed from that employer. So any physical, forceful interference, you could provide them a job yourself. You could say, hey, come move in with me. You could, there's a ton of other things you can do. But to forcibly stop them from, say, a corporation going to the Philippines or China or Taiwan or Japan, even though they're putting people in vulnerable positions, it is a better choice that that person has. And that is the reason they are choosing to do it. And the employer is not initiating violence. So I don't believe it's justified in forcibly stopping them from interacting. That would be my response to the employee-employer relationship, but I'm totally open to gift economies. I'm totally open to the fact that money is an artificial creation, that central bankers use it to manipulate the energy within society and control the masses. I'm totally open to that. The capitalist just says that even if you're not necessarily working somewhere, you can acquire more power throughout society so long as it's done voluntarily by not initiating violence. I see power sort of as something neutral. I think it's sort of good that, I don't know, Eminem has a lot of power in when he makes a tweet or when he puts out an album, a lot of people have access to it. If I put out an album, I don't have as much power and influence as Eminem, but that is the result of people making voluntary decisions. So the difference between Jeff Bezos and Donald Trump, I would say, is Bezos today, right now, forget about how it got there. If people want to stop trading with Bezos today, he has no right, recognized, to initiate violence against those people. Trump, on the other hand, does. That's why Trump and the state are immoral, I believe, and Bezos is morally justified. And if people want to go elsewhere, they have the right to. So that is my response to the employer aspect of this. I want to go back to your definition of anarchism regarding Chomsky's definition. Don't you think that also applies to a lot of statists in the sense of if Russians interfere with our lives, then that's illegitimate authority. That's unjustified. The Mexican drug cartel doesn't have these rights. No other group has rights to interfere except this group called the government. So is it necessarily incredulity towards power dynamics is what defines anarchism? Or is a better definition without rulers, without people who have the right to initiate aggression?
Well, what I'd say off is that anarchism does mean without rulers. It doesn't necessarily mean without rules or without the use of force. We would have used some other thing about to stop the use of force. Now, in general, I'm against the use of force. I'm very anti-war. What I would point to with Jeff Bezos, as you mentioned, here's the thing about Jeff Bezos. So the thing about capitalism and about private ownership of private property, and there's a distinction in socialist philosophy between personal property, stuff that you have and physically possess, and private property, stuff that you own because a piece of paper says you own it. And you know, it's owned in a legal sense, but you don't have it, you don't use it. So let's take, for instance, you talked about Donald Trump can initiate force and Jeff Bezos cannot. So if Jeff Bezos one day wakes up to find an email from all of his workers at Amazon, and they say, Jeff, we don't like you. We don't think you're running the company the right way. We are not going to be sending you your paycheck anymore, and we are not going to be doing what you say anymore. We're going to run this the way we want to. Now, Jeff Bezos can then call the police and have every single one of those people arrested. And if he did not have that ability, if the state was not there, if the military was not there, he would have no ability to enforce that kind of, and that is an initiation of force. You know, however you want to look at it. You can say that, well, Jeff Bezos owns the company, so he's not really initiating force. But I mean, first off, the whole idea of who initiated force, it doesn't quite track. Because when you try to put things in terms of subjective ideas like who is defending and who is attacking, you run into a problem like with Israel and Palestine. Both parties will claim that they are just defending themselves. And in their minds, a lot of the time, they're both right. They are just defending themselves. But what happens here is it's this and then that and then that. You show me any great concentration of power or wealth, you know, there's a giant pile of bodies underneath it. And we can keep going back and back and back and back in history until we get to the first guy to lay down a fence and say, this is mine, as Rousseau said, and realize that that is the very first initiation of force. I mean, when you use your power to claim a territory, any kind of territory, even if it's not owned, you, by definition, you exclude everyone else from claiming that. And that is force against people, even if it's not directly against their bodies.
Yeah, I don't see the difference, I would say, between Trump claiming ownership over the country and Bezos claiming ownership over Amazon is, to my knowledge, I'm using that as a general example, that in order for Bezos to have contracts with other people, with the employees, with the customers, it is done through voluntary interaction and with property that was contractually or voluntarily acquired. So as opposed to just saying, America is ours, we're settling it here, and that's that. That, I believe, is very different than acquiring land through original appropriation, buying it, being the first to use it. I believe those are just ways of acquiring property and having ownership over it, whereas the other way of simply just claiming it, as the state does, and whereas no other organization has the right that the state does in that aspect, I believe that is what makes the state illegitimate.
Okay. If I could ask, though, really quickly, I'm sorry. So why is being the first person to claim something, why is that just, but then being the second person to claim it from them is unjust?
I think the first person has a better claim, because to say that that there can't be a first person is to say no one has the right to go into territory that they have not acquired. So there cannot be a second person unless there is a first person. That is the only objective way that we can consistently apply a property rule. I believe I didn't work for my face or my body really, or my race or my skin color, but that is the objective link that I have with it. And with regards to others, I believe that gives me a better claim to my body. So even though it might be good for the community to enslave me or draft me or take my stuff, there might be utilitarian benefits, I still believe I have the claim to make the final call with what I do with my body or my house or land I acquire through voluntary exchange, even if it means sitting around eating Doritos until, you know, the fire department has to come lift me out of wherever. So I care much more about the rights aspect, and whatever follows, follows. I'm not as much of a utilitarian in that aspect. If I were to tell you that, and I'm really trying not to set up a straw man, I'm curious about your thought process, the anarcho-communist thought process with regard to these things. If I told you that I was engaging in rape, murder, theft, and slavery, would you want to wait to hear the details about it to see what the consequences are, or would you be inherently opposed to it?
I mean, would I have a strong emotional reaction if you were raping people or enslaving them? Yeah, I'd get pretty pissed. You know, but at the same time, I probably should not necessarily act in passion at that point, because we can be mistaken. a lot of the time, and sometimes an individual's view of reality is not accurate. So yeah, I mean, I think that there needs to be forbearance and compassion, even in the worst possible situations, just because you could be wrong. And, you know, if I think that you're enslaving people and then I run off and kill you and it turns out I was wrong, well, oops, you know, and that's something I can't take back. That's something nobody can take back. And the repercussions of that are going to ripple throughout the society. I suppose, you know, if you talk about utilitarian versus deontological morality, so you've got outcome-based morality and rule-based morality. I think you kind of can't put one above the other, like maybe in certain situations, but if you go pure utilitarian morality, the big problem, there becomes a number of big problems. One, any small sacrifice is justifiable in terms of a greater good, which is a very big problem. But I think the bigger problem is we don't know the future. We don't know that the actions that we think are going to be good are actually good. The road to hell is paved with good intentions. That said, at the same time, deontological morality, if you cleave too strongly to rule-based morality, you're going to find all the problems of not just bureaucracy, but all the problems of the state that we have, where you know, people will eventually deploy violence against rule breakers, and that violence may not bear any possible proportion to the crime that was done. So I think for humans, you know, it's kind of like the end of Watchmen. You know, in the comic book with the giant squid. Spoiler alert. Ozymandias embodies essentially utilitarian morality, and Rorschach, who was actually conceived as kind of a take that at sort of Ayn Rand, Randian ideology, he embodies deontological morality. He even has that line at the end: "Never compromise, not even in the face of Armageddon." And you're left at the end of Watchmen, you're like, oh my God, that was so brilliant. I don't know who to choose. That's the trick. You don't know who to choose because the human brain doesn't choose between one or the other. The human brain uses both. The answer at the end of Watchmen is punish Ozymandias, stick him in a cell where he's got to look at pictures and read the bios of everyone he killed forever and leave him there, and then leave his deception in place. But, you know, if you did that, the story wouldn't have such a compelling ending, and I wouldn't be talking about it right now.
Okay,
Yeah,
I kind of want to jump in.
Yeah.
I want to jump in for a second just because I have something of an opinion here, because there's also such a thing as rule-based utilitarianism.
Correct.
And so it's you're operating everyday life with kind of rules, but ultimately what you think matters is the consequences and, you know, the greater good.
That's a very good point.
And
you know what?
I also have I just
Oh,
want to say one more thing, which is
okay.
this. I also think that when thinking about utilitarianism, you have to think about it in the broadest scope, and you also have to realize, as Brent said, that you don't know the future, and you don't want to just like you can't be like short-sighted and be like murder is okay because this guy's being an asshole and the world will be better off without him. You can't think like that, and you there's like so many things that you can't assume you know that much. And I also think you have to incorporate the human intuition for justice into the utilitarian framework, because it's part of human nature. And so you have to incorporate all aspects of human nature and moral intuitions into that utilitarianism when trying to decide how we should operate as moral agents.
Yeah, and also there's a difference between like how somebody operates personally and how someone operates in a specific role in society, which kind of goes back to why there's a big problem with the state. You know, I moderate an ANCAP v. ANCOM debate forum, or it's now Libertarian versus Anarchism, because the ANCAP v. ANCOM debate forum that was started with by people that were butthurt that they got banned for saying racial slurs every 5 minutes. They started a rival group, and we wanted to make sure to distinguish ourselves, so we moved from that. Just little plug there. But when I'm functioning as an admin, I'm essentially the state in that space. And I realize that because of the way people look at me and the way they react to my actions within that space, sometimes I have to draw a harder line than I would personally, and sometimes I have to draw a softer line than I would personally for one reason or another. I mean, that's really the big problem with politics and institutions. They, to a certain extent, remove choice from the person who is engaging within them. And as a result, you can sometimes, if that runs away with you, you can find people who otherwise would be fine people doing absolutely monstrous things.
Absolutely. That is a terrific point. And I loved your answer about the, you know, I'm a slavery advocate and a murderer. That was really good. About rule-based utilitarianism, I think that is a great marriage of the two philosophies. In other words, I think theft is wrong. Now, would I steal bread to feed my family? I would, but I would do it with the recognition that I was engaging in theft, and I have to make that right in the long run. About the, I think utilitarianism has gotten a bad name simply because it's so often the cry of the politicians for their justification of massive crimes. All right, we killed 100,000 people in one day with one bomb, but they thought the emperor was a god. What the hell? At what point are you the bad guy? So that is why I think, that rule-based utilitarianism, I think that is a terrific way to look at it. As far as the power of institutions, again, I go back to there are two ways you can really get power or do anything. But as far as you being the Facebook admin, I was in the ANCAP-ANCOM debate group, and I was not, no one initiated force against me to join. When I wanted to leave, no one initiated force against me. Everything there I did was contractual. So the same would apply, I think, with Walmart. Even though it's so big, it is difficult for individuals to have an impact or to have freedom in their interactions, even though often if you go to the manager and complain, they'll help out the customer. So I see it more as not the managers are the bosses. We see a lot of people change manager positions. We see a lot of companies go out of business. The Dow Jones used to have some companies. Now it has different ones. I think the consumer has a lot more power. Granted, that's spread out because that's why Blockbuster no longer exists, because many consumers made choices. I see it more as something neutral, that if power is the result of initiating violence, it's immoral. If it's the result of people just making decisions that happen to benefit them, I don't see that as inherently unjust. I absolutely see that it's susceptible to corruption, but it's also susceptible to doing very good things. If, you know, the Brents of the world got a big show on CNN and got to explain the immorality, and got to explain, say, the immorality of foreign policy, or even the immorality of having a boss. I'm totally down for that being an illegitimate form of how to structure your life. I don't believe in initiating aggression against bosses or employees if they try to contract. But yeah, so I see power in that voluntary sense much more as neutral. Could be good, could be bad. I see aggression as inherently immoral. And that is the anarcho-capitalist approach to things such as power differentials within society.
Yeah. Okay. So that's. Let me give you a little hypothetical here. You are dangling off a cliff by a rope. Below you is a huge chasm. If you fall, you're dead. There's a guy at the other end of that rope, and he says, "Give me your watch, or I drop you." Now, if you give him your watch, has he robbed you, or have you made a free choice?
Did the guy push me in the first place?
I would say in this case, it doesn't track 100% with reality, because I would say in this case, it was like you were born on that rope.
Okay.
And that guy's that guy's grandfather pushed your grandfather, and your family has lived on that end of the rope for like 6 generations.
Oh, okay. It's my mother's umbilical cord, and I've grown to be 21, and I've grown a lot. Okay. No, he would not be stealing it from me. He did not initiate aggression against me. As much as I would hate that and feel exploited, I still think that he has a right to offer to help me. He also has a right to not help me and walk away. He would be a total jerk, but every moment we spend talking about this and not getting food to the hungry, we are, in a sense, letting someone go. So does he have a right to not help me? Yes. I want him to help me, so a profit incentive is a great way to get him to voluntarily assist me. So no, he would not be stealing from me if he said, give me your watch.
Okay. Second hypothetical, you are in the desert. There is a guy hundreds of miles around, you can't escape. You're in the desert. There is a guy standing there in front of the only spring for miles. And you want to drink, you need to drink from this water, you're going to die within like an hour, let's say. The guy says, you may not drink from the water. This is my private property. You try everything you can to get him to drink from the water. You offer him everything. He refuses. So you're sitting there about ready to start to die of thirst. Are you justified in attacking him to get this water?
No, I don't think so. I don't think that I would be. Would I be justified in attacking him? Back to the stealing bread, I get it's the same principle. But
well, I think there's a distinction to be made, because there's one, as we kind of referenced before, there's something you want as the societal standard. For example, so if I don't know how you enforce contracts in your model of the world, Keith, but say there's like a private police force that you could have enforce private property and contracts. You would want them to, arrest the guy who attacks the guy who's guarding the water, but you might still say it's morally justified because the guy's just trying to save his life.
Yeah. So I would say that I have a right to drink the water in a utilitarian scale sense. In other words, I could violate his right that he does have, because he has a right to not be there and not produce anything. As far as if everyone had that right, though, and the root of morality is applying it consistently, not applying rules to different people for different reasons, that is why I'm against the state. It is the archon, the anarchy, the ruler. The anarchist wants no rulers. So I would say that if that were the case, then every person without water has the right to come into my house, give themselves a home, take my water, and then I don't have it. So by virtue of having something and using it, you are excluding others. By me drinking the water, I'm excluding everyone else. So for the same reason I have the right to exclude, he also has that right to exclude. I just want to jump. I would, however, I'm sorry to interrupt you. I would, however, engage in the rights violation, and once I got to land, attempt to compensate him. I would be in the wrong, though, but I would do it with the idea of a bigger picture in mind.
I just wanted to object. I just want to quickly object to the idea that if you universalize that principle, what you get is only the people who are dying of thirst in the desert coming to get water, like attacking people to get water. Presumably the situation is not just like left and right, everyone's dying of thirst. And if you've got that situation, then good luck enforcing any system. I just wanted to make that clear. I think that's that's how you universalize that principle. Anyway.
The principle wasn't dealing with a desert. The principle was who has the right to use what.
Yeah, well, the desert was just I'm just trying to figure out exactly where you draw the line. I would actually disagree with you in the sense that the law needs to necessarily be applied in the exact same way to every person in every case. I do agree that people are entitled to equal protection under the law, assuming that there is a law. But I also think that it's a lot of times you need to take specific circumstances into account.
Sure.
When dealing with any kind of an issue. And really, like, if you have a person who is not initiating force directly, but is holding onto resources that if others do not obtain them, they will die. I really don't see how that is any different. It may be different in how they actually go about doing it, but in outcome, that's not much different than walking up to someone and stabbing them, honestly. So I would say that, a lot of this comes into when is it okay to override specific rules in society. And each person has a different threshold for when it is okay to do that. I guess that's kind of what things come down to with the concept of revolution. I mean, the idea that somebody is has the only possible source of water in the desert, it's happened before, but it's mostly ridiculous. But here's the point. If one person has more than they need to live comfortably, way more than they need to live comfortably, and another person does not have enough to live at all, I think it is inherently immoral to allow that situation to continue. Because at the end of the day, one person's life is worth far more than another person's luxury.
Yes. Okay. A couple things about the. I'm not sure which angle I want to take this at, but the water example I think would still apply to personal property or even a house. I'm homeless, yet you have an extra room. Do I have the right to break in, hold you at gunpoint, say, let me sleep here? So I'm not sure that that is a uniquely anarcho-capitalist trip up.
Well, hang on. I'm sorry. I don't mean to interrupt, but with regard to personal property and private property, I would agree that if I'm homeless, I don't have the right to break into someone else's house that they are currently using and demand shelter, because that's just robbing Peter to pay Paul. However, in the United States right now, for instance, we have enough empty homes for every homeless person to have, I believe, 7 to themselves. So what's going on here? These homes are kept empty. They're kept empty by the people who own them, and there's a number of reasons behind that. But I would say if there's an empty building or empty home that is habitable and nobody else is using it and you don't have a home, you absolutely have a right to that.
Yeah, and I think the only reason, whether it's legally or morally, the only reason that those homes exist is that the builders claimed the right to build on it and create the homes in the first place. So we have first creation and then we have distribution.
Well, the builders didn't create, the builders, the actual workers who constructed the home, yeah, they did that. But Correct. They're not the ones who own the home. The capitalists who provided, the strongest possible case is they provided the monetary investment to build the home. Yet they own it even though they didn't build it and maybe they've never even seen it in their entire life. So the question is, again, is it justified to keep someone who doesn't have a home out because this other person who's maybe never even been there owns it on a piece of paper?
Yes, I believe they have the best claim of who can get it, whether it's in exchange for money or time or entertainment or just a gift. There's tons of charitable ways to give people resources. That includes money, computers, houses, microphones, or anything else. As far as who owns it, that is why you would exchange in the first place, or else only workers would have houses, but they wouldn't have food. So they would also not have any clothes. So they would exchange. That's the only reason you would work to build something. So they could, in exchange, trade it to the capitalist, to the bank, to the property owners to the manufacturers. That's the only reason you do it in the first place. So I see the
for the record, I disagree with that. I mean, you can keep going. I don't want to interrupt you, but I disagree with that. And I can explain why later.
With which aspect?
That the only reason anyone would build a house is if they were getting something out of it.
Correct. I'm sorry. Let me clarify. Thank you for stopping me so I can clarify that. What I meant to say, no, I could definitely see labor of love being a mechanism of motivation for people to build things. I've done a lot of non-paying jobs that I have received a benefit for. You could just have machines doing it. So I worded that incorrectly.
Yeah.
Thank you.
I mean, I got a quick, yeah, no problem. Okay, so have you ever been unemployed for like a long period of time?
Yes.
Okay, so I have as well. My job used to have me go through periods where I would need to be on benefits for a month at a time. And one of the things that I noticed, the longest this ever went was like 6 months. Even though I was getting paid and I was more or less comfortable during this time, it was some of the most depressed I'd ever been in my life. And it wasn't just because I didn't have a job, it was because I wasn't working. I really think that people, when it comes to labor, labor is something we do almost on a compulsive level. It's Marx called it our, I can't say the word, but our species essence, essentially. And I think the idea that we need to be cajoled with either the carrot or the stick into doing necessary labor is kind of a false idea created by the society that exists around us. When labor needs to be done for yourself or for those you live around or work with, people tend to do it. You know, I don't clean my bathroom because somebody's paying me to do it. I clean my bathroom because I don't want to have a gross bathroom and I want to provide a nice place for my family. So, you know, I really think that the idea that these houses would not be built without this overarching system is kind of it's a false dichotomy. It's a catch-22. Houses get built in capitalism because of monetary investment, because capitalism is this type of system that incentivizes monetary investment. If we had a different system, there would be other reasons to do these.
And I definitely agree. And you can disagree with what motivates people or why they choose to make certain decisions and still be an anarcho-capitalist or communist. These are just, you know, more observations. The principled stance is whether you have a right to own something. That I guess our difference would be a right to own and exclude others from something you don't personally use. As far as about the house, yeah, I can see that money is a motivator. I've definitely learned that it's not the only motivator. Achieving your own happiness, making others around you happy. A lot of people do a lot of things that are not monetarily related. So I'm much more open now than I was a couple years ago to things like a gift economy, and as I mentioned, money possibly just being a total unnecessary artificial creation. So yeah, I don't see any major disagreement there. What my point was is that it wouldn't make sense for the workers to build it and then continue to own it. That was just my sense, because then if everyone owned everything that they only built, well, it would suck because you'd have a ton of one thing that you wouldn't necessarily need. You'd want to exchange for other things. So my point was it would only benefit them to build it if they could later exchange it. Because after 50,000 houses, you don't value that house anymore. So that was my point, not that money is the only human motivator. Thank you for giving me a chance to correct that.
Yeah, no problem. So I kind of have a question, and this is sort of about how you mentioned that the consumer has a lot more power in our society, and I'd agree to a certain extent it does in terms of like certain businesses. But also, you know, a lot of the ways in which the consumer is removed from the labor that goes into that thing and doesn't really understand it, oftentimes results in the consumer doing some pretty horrific things that they wouldn't do otherwise if they were more more tuned in with the reality of how the product comes to them. I mean, a good example, Coca-Cola hired mercenaries to murder union leaders in Nicaragua. That's a fact. And I still drink Coke. I even know that. But I never met the person who was murdered. I never met their families. I didn't have to look them in the eye and say, you know what, I don't care because I get this Coke for $1.50 or whatever. At the same time, we know that our cell phones are assembled by virtual slave labor. I mean, these are workers in Foxconn plants are literally jumping from the building, and they've had to erect suicide nets to keep people from killing themselves. Walmart engages in illegal logging in Siberian tiger preserves. Nike has used sweatshop labor for years and generations, and then you've got stuff like that collapse in, I believe, 2013 that killed thousands of people. And we've seen this throughout history. Like, you talk about a society that is run entirely on the free market, where the state does not tell the business what to do. It's often made in utopian concepts, but we know that this has happened before. Go back, look at the age of heroic commerce, when the British East India Company controlled huge sections of the world. And yes, they were licensed by the crown, but the crown did not have the military ability to control them. And we see what happens when the British East India Company, when they controlled India, for instance, like in a year, they starved 10% of the Indian subcontinent to death. In the play, you know, they overturned traditional ways of dealing with famines, and the famine that they caused actually wound up causing the people that lived in towns that had railroads to die faster than the people that lived out in the sticks, because the railroads were able to ship out all of these products so much faster. And you know, at the end of the day, the people in the East India Company didn't care about the people working for them because they were abstractions, and the people in England who were consuming these products also didn't care because they were so far removed from the process. So I feel like a lot of the time when we divert to this consumer culture, and when we divert to these kinds of companies and letting them run things the way they want to, it can become some of the biggest mistakes that we've ever had, absolutely on par with the worst excesses of the Soviet Union.
So the Holodomor, you would say, is on par with the British East India Company activities in India that were a causal result of capitalism and private property?
Absolutely. I'd say, and in fact, the British probably killed more than Stalin did with the Holodomor. I would have to actually compare the numbers. And then also, you know, there's the line from The Big Lebowski, say what you will about the tenets of National Socialism, at least it's an ethos. You know, when people, when people get killed by these people who are possessed by this ideology that twists their brains, in a way, it's less bad than when people get killed just because somebody wants money. Like Leopold II in the Congo. He easily killed as many Congolese as Hitler killed Jews and gypsies and, Romani and homosexuals and anarchists. You know, but he didn't have this master race idea. He was just like, hey, I'd really like some rubber, so let's cut off everybody's freaking hands.
that is a funny implication in the movie. So again, what I had said about power sort of being neutral, so long as it doesn't initiate violence directly, I would say that is a perfect example of consumers could use their power to do great things, like get iPhones or get houses or cars, or go from Blockbuster to Netflix or Sears to Walmart. They can do things like incentivize big food production that makes people have food, or it could be in the case of, you know, the Indian example you gave. That's an example of power being not necessarily good or bad. It could be used in some cases to do good, other cases to do bad, but it's not inherently immoral. So the private property ethic. So I'm totally open to consumers having more or less power, or managers' powers being moved around. I don't think any of that refutes the anarcho-capitalist claim to private property.
I mean, I think my biggest issue with private property kind of does come down to, and I have a number of issues with it, but it does come down to the fact that it centralizes power in just a couple of hands, and power builds power. A great example, we recently had this scandal where, you know, a bunch of CEOs and very rich Hollywood actors were buying their kids' ways into the top institutions. And I was mad about that because some of those institutions, like Yale, I applied to Yale like 5 times. You know, the thing is that I don't have, I'm probably smarter than just about every one of those kids. In fact, I can say I'm definitely smarter because they've grown up without having to deal with adversity. It's obvious, like you can watch the videos of the kids talking about it. And I feel bad for them. I genuinely do. But what happens is that once you go through one generation, let's say wealth can be earned, that generation earns its wealth, that power tends to explode out exponentially. And eventually it puts somebody into a position where either they are too, they're either too stupid or too evil to use it responsibly. Donald Trump, great example. You know, he says, my father never gave me anything. I just started with a small loan of $1 million. And then he stole like 20 million more from his dad to get his business running. And now he's president because, oh God. But you get what I'm saying, is power begets power. So when we allow someone to pull to themselves more power and property than they can physically claim and hold and use at once, you set a very bad precedent for more of these abuses to happen.
Absolutely, I see that as a possibility. But can power be used for good? And in those cases, it would be justified in expanding. For example, how many people would have independently come up with the printing press if Gutenberg's power was regulated to only his society or county or city? In that case, him having a lot of power and influence, I think, was a great thing. In the case of Stalin having power, or Churchill having power, or David Lloyd George, yeah, it can do terrible things. A lot of those terrible things are terrible insofar as they initiate violence against peaceful people. The wrong thing the Coca-Cola company did in the countries where it assassinated union leaders, we're saying that's wrong because it initiates violence against peaceful people. They weren't defending themselves against the union bosses. They were initiating violence. So that, I believe, brings us down to the philosophy of the anarcho-capitalism that I advocate.
Wait, can I jump in here? So did the printing press guy, what was his name? Gutenberg. Did he have, was he the inventor of the printing press? Is that what he did?
You know what? I actually don't know, but I'm saying that is the recognized person who was credited with it. But I can't even say I've done a Google search to verify.
How does power relate to him? Did he have a lot of money or something?
No, his method was used by many, many, many people around the world. So he, in that sense, has probably more power and influence than any other person to this day. I mean, I have 10 books in this little shelf right here that I don't think would exist in the absence of his power and influence. His power, I believe, is justified because it's nonviolent. George W. Bush's, I believe, was unjustified because it was founded in initiating violence. By definition, is why I don't like the state, and I'm okay with the other organizations. That is just the example that came to mind.
Well, that type of power seems distinct from the type that Brent is talking about, which is like the accumulation of money.
Yeah, I don't think it is. Let's say you have the power to influence and motivate people in the book industry. Imagine controlling all the books. Pierpont Morgan had a conspiracy to control the top 25 newspapers, according to Congressional Record, in a book titled Foundations, Their Power and Influence by Renee A. Wormser from the Reese Committee. Just by owning those, they had a ton of power and influence to control the masses. I see it as just as control-y or power manipulation as having control over money or property. The ability to influence minds, I think I'd rather have that than $10 billion, honestly.
Right, but $10 billion gets you the ability to influence minds. You can buy a PR firm to do that for you. And in fact, what's his face, Leopold II, like, that's what he did. He ran counter PR when people started to expose the murders that he was committing, and he got away with it much longer than he otherwise would because he had control of, not direct control, but control of so much of the media because he was so wealthy. You know, I mean, what was it? Who was the guy who started the Spanish-American War to sell newspapers? Was it
William Randolph Hearst?
Yeah, William Randolph Hearst, where he sent the guy down to report on the war. The guy said, there is no war down here in Cuba. What are you talking about? And he said, you provide the pictures, I'll provide the war. You know, I mean, at the end of the day, is it a good idea to let a few families or a few companies or a few individuals pull this much power to themselves if we can actually prevent it? I think it is, and I think it may in fact be a moral duty for us to do so. Now, yeah, I would agree, power comes in a lot of forms, and power is definitely not always evil. I would say the ability to make your will manifest on the world is something, I'd say that's neutral. But I'd also say that once the proportion becomes out of sync with what a human is normally used to, we wind up making monsters of men. So I think my argument here might be that if we got rid of the capitalist class, if we eliminated that kind of ownership, and let's just say I wave a magic wand and suddenly Amazon is equally owned and controlled by every single one who works for it. And the same thing happens with Sony and Coca-Cola. And whenever a new employee comes in, they are, again, granted an equal share in the company after a certain time. I feel like we might be able to have all of the wonderful benefits of civilization and mass production without destroying our communities, without corrupting our political institutions, and without killing and maiming and injuring our workers in psychological and physical ways. Where the guy in the Foxconn factory, he owns an equal share in Foxconn with everyone else, so he does not feel compelled by hopelessness to jump.
Yeah, and I am totally open to everyone having an equal share or only a couple people having most shares. I don't know what's best. I believe the way to determine that is through voluntary exchange and contract. I don't know the right amount, the number. I could see, you know, maybe some problems with if everyone had a say, the computer or the microphone or the ceiling fan, if all of those workers had a say, would the product be as good? Would it be better? I have no clue. Would someone also want to be in charge of what happens, or is it better for them, most economical, to show up, do the job, and go home and not have to worry about things the manager does? Anthony Cumia said, I get I'm using anecdotal, but when Anthony Cumia says, I finally became my own boss when I got fired from Sirius, and then I hated it so much that I just started delegating responsibility to everyone else. I don't know what's best for other people. What I do know is initiating violence against peaceful people and their property that they've acquired through voluntarism is unjust. That is my only claim. I'm not saying I have an opinion necessarily on money or banking or bosses or how big a business should be, or if it should be the dollar or pesos or cryptocurrency or how communication should be done. I'm just saying no initiating violence against peaceful people. To do so is to claim a higher claim over their body, and that is a violation of the anarchist principle of no rulers. That is my justification for my philosophy, and I don't think Brent has given me any justification for why latecomers or aggression is justified. So that is why I'm going to continue to hold it, but I'm open to other things that I might be overlooking.
Yeah, actually, I have a bit of a response to that. Have you ever seen Adventure Time, the cartoon, with Jake and with Finn and Jake?
No.
You should watch it. It's brilliant. It genuinely is. It's hilarious and insightful and everything. There's an episode of it that specifically revolves around rent and ownership, where the vampire that owns Finn and Jake's treehouse that they live in sells it to one of Jake's sons, who then, in an effort to, without getting too much into the plot, he sets rent on them that they cannot pay, and then proceeds to kick them out of their own home. And there's a bit in the thing where they're sitting there arrested by the banana guards, and Finn just turns to Jake and he's like, what in the world is happening? Like, what the heck is a deed? And how can Marceline sell our house when it's our house and we live there, and now we're arrested? It's crazy. And Jake responds, you know, man, the laws aren't made to help earthy cats like us. You know, here on our planet, back in the old days, in the real old days, it was every man for himself, scribbling and scrobbling for the good stuff. And the biggest, meanest men got the best stuff. They took the green valleys and said, all right, this is ours, and you all scratch, you get sand. And that's when they made the laws. They said, this is fair now, this is the law. Once they were winning, they changed the rules. And in a lot of ways, that mirrors the development of property norms and private property norms in the United States and in the world as a whole. Initially, it was that property was claimed violently by armies, and that's exactly what happened here when we stole the Native Americans' land. It was a protracted war and genocide. And then once we got things the way we liked it, and not we, not me and you, we're just the children of this. You know, our great-great-grandparents, or the great-great-grandparents of a few of us, because most of people aren't evil, just the few who ran the United States and Russia and England and everything else, they immediately then claimed legitimacy, claimed the law, and suddenly you have to deal with them on their terms. So I would reject the idea that aggression has not been already engaged against us, and that people have every right to respond to that aggression with aggression in kind. Now, do I think there should be a giant war against these people? No, I don't think that's going to solve anything at this point. You know, you get into the problem of when is it time to forgive? But I think to forgive and to move beyond this savage history of humanity, what we need first is we need equity. And we need to make sure that these patterns do not repeat again. And that may involve stripping those who currently have ill-gotten gains of them, or even well-gotten gains. Because whether, though, you know, you talk about the initiation of force, it's like going up in elementary school and saying, he started it. And how often does the teacher or the parent say, I don't care who started it? And that's really kind of where I am right now. I don't care necessarily who initiates what, because that's a game that just goes on to infinite regress. What I care about is what is going to promote a peaceful, harmonious, and compassionate society where we do not destroy the earth and each other. At the moment, my answer for that is anarchism. I think that when we have divided the power in that manner, it becomes a natural check on itself, and that it also provides the greatest amount of human freedom. Because if you have freedom from not just the stick, but also the carrot, then we can really see what humans are like. I'll end my thing with a quote from Emma Goldman. She famously said, what of human nature, will it endure under anarchism? Poor human nature. What horrible crimes have been committed in your name. Every fool, from king to policeman to visionless dabbler in science, to flat-headed parson, presumes to speak authoritatively about human nature. And the greater their wickedness, the greater their insistence on the wickedness of humans. John Burroughs has stated in Experiments that you cannot judge an animal in captivity when torn from field and forest. Similarly, how can we speak to human nature and its potentialities in this current society with every heart wounded, fettered, and maimed, every soul in a prison? So I really feel like if we want to get to a point where we as people bring out the best in ourselves and the best in everyone else around us, we have to unleash everyone's power in the best way, and we have to unleash it in a way that is as equitable as possible, because if we do not, if we allow this family or this corporation or that corporation or this politician or that politician an inordinate share of it, it will be abused, if not by them, by their children. And so, you know, that's why I'm a communist to this day. Yeah, there we go.
And I don't necessarily, okay, so the Young Turks have, I think, 10 million more, 10 million times the subscribers that I do. Is that unjust? Well, I think it is, because they're crooks. But as far as, so I see that inequality and I say, I need to do everything that doesn't include violence to get that flipped over and to get people to look at them only for comedic purposes. So what I do see when I see inequality is you can change that any way you want. I don't have the right to initiate violence against Anna Kasparian and Cenk, and I don't have the right to forcibly stop people from watching them. I don't have the right to forcibly take their studio and use it for my own purposes, for the purposes of equality. Even though,
yeah, but do you die if Young Turks have a better audience than you?
No, I think Young Turks have killed a lot of people. I'm not sure.
Fair enough. They are named after a group that did a horrific amount of violence. Yeah, I'm still mad at the Turks because they are currently just waiting to pounce on the PKK and the YPG in Syria. Yeah.
But it's, as far as the, you said the land was stolen from the Native Americans. Did the Native Americans own the land? If so, why?
I mean, the Native Americans didn't have a concept of ownership of land. They didn't believe it was the kind of thing that you could own. They used the land. They absolutely did. And in fact, there's a great speech. I won't go into it because I don't fully remember it, and it's really beautiful, but look it up, by what Tecumseh said to future President William Henry Harrison, I think it was, about property specifically, and about how what the white man was imposing upon the Indians. So, I mean, we as this imperialistic feudal culture came in and imposed via force our method of dealing with the use of property and land on peaceful people who did not even share that idea. So I think that was definitely a theft, because it was a theft by one specific nation from all who otherwise would use it.
Did they have the right to forcibly resist the aggressors, in this case, the imperialist, as the case in point, let's say, Wounded Knee? The U.S. military there to disarm the Lakota. They did?
Yeah, they have every right to resist. It didn't work, sadly, for a number of reasons. But, you know, and that's one of the other big problems. I'm actually going to quote Jeffrey Tucker here, as much as he drives me up the wall. He's a right libertarian thinker. He said, might does not necessarily make right, but might makes reality. And I think that, sadly, that is in fact the case.
Yes. Another question I have. Let's say, I think to be in the top 1% of the world, you have to live in America, England, or Australia and earn $32,500 in dollars annually. Do people in Haiti or Guatemala have the right to initiate violence against the world's 1% to acquire resources?
Well, what I would say about like people in less developed, like third world cultures, do they have the right to initiate violence? I mean, they probably do. I don't think it would be a good idea, but they probably do. I think there's also a problem with claiming like the global 1% and basing that on, on money. In particular, there's a great story about. And really, I would highly recommend that everybody look into the history of the country that the Khmer Rouge was in, Cambodia. And Cambodia is a very interesting case because it is a country that went from a population of peaceful Theravada Buddhists to a place where gangs of people were tearing infants in half. And that was before communism ever came to that country. When Westerners first appeared in Cambodia, they found that the farmers would work 6 months out of the year and rest 6 months out of the year. And they gave them new Western agriculture techniques, which they allowed them to double their harvests. And they expected that they would double their harvest and sell the stuff. And instead what they did was they worked 3 months out of the year and rested 9 months, which I really think is a much more healthy approach to society. So I reject the idea that someone in the third world, by virtue of making and living on less money, is necessarily better off than a poor person in the United States, especially when you get down to people like the homeless people. And I think that the idea of the global 1% is something that the actual 1% has spit out to us in order to protect themselves from retribution at our hands.
Okay, we got about 15 minutes left to go here, so let's just keep that in mind. And also,
I just have a couple more questions for Brent. They're sort of fire round. I just wanted to get how he thinks. Do I have the right to sell my labor? You may not approve of it, but do I have the right to sell my labor to an employer for 1 cent an hour?
I mean, do you have the right to do that? Yes. Will I go after your employer if he takes that thing? Yes. Everybody imagines that they say, everyone imagines that they're the employer in that situation, but they never actually think of the reality of them being the tomato picker. So yeah, you got the right to sell your labor for whatever you want to, but if you're in a position where you're accepting 1 cent an hour, I would question why you're accepting that 1 cent an hour and what that guy is doing to you.
What I was doing in the case of getting $0.00 an hour was gaining on-the-job experience that allowed me to sell my labor for more in the future. I was postponing consumption. Was I morally justified in doing that?
You were morally justified in doing that. Again, the people who took advantage of that situation to put you in an unpaid internship are the ones I would take issue with.
When you say take issue, would you forcibly stop us from trading?
It depends. I would, rather than forcibly stop you from trading, I would probably, if I had the ability to do it, find a way to remove them from the position of power that they are in, where they are offering that bad deal.
Do I have a right to go in the middle of nowhere and not do anything with the land, not make it of use at all?
Is probably for the best. Yeah, he's absolutely got that right.
So I have a right to not do it. Do I have the right to grow things?
Yeah, I'd say so.
And would I have a right to make a contract with someone that I'll give them time, money, entertainment, and a good recommendation if they do the job for me and we split it up together?
I would say you have the right to make that offer. Again, the issue is less an issue of whether you have the right to make an offer or they have a right to accept an offer, and more what is the power dynamic going on between the two of you at that point in time. I mean, if you go back to the founding of the United States, there were contracts for indentured servitude that eventually became the first slaves. And on the contracts, it stated that these two parties were equal parties. But in reality, no, they were not equal parties. And many of them were, in fact, slaves or people who had been convicted of various crimes like stealing bread. And then they're put into a position where they have to sign away their lives for 7 years and go over to another continent, or they get hung. So, you know, I feel like a trade is only valid if both parties stand to gain and lose similar amounts by walking away from the deal or not doing the deal at all.
Okay, so in the example of prostitution, would you do you believe people have a right to engage in prostitution?
I mean, I don't have a problem with sex work. I have a problem with pimps, and I have a problem with human traffickers.
So if the pimp facilitates finding the customers and bringing them to the prostitutes, in exchange making both parties happier, giving them more options and more choices, always having the ability to opt out, would the pimp then be morally justified as an agent?
Sure, but that's not usually how things work with pimps. Pimps usually use violence, intimidation, brainwashing tactics to force people to bend to their will. That's very common.
And I guess the last thing I would ask about this, would I have the right to sell those paintings behind you?
Would you have the right? Let me know if you can find a buyer, because I have a kid. But yeah, I'd rather you didn't. But if you can find me a buyer, I'm not going to complain.
No, I'm asking in the sense of who has the right to sell it, me, or do I have to get your permission? If I have your permission, can I make a profit off that exchange?
If you've got in this case, I don't feel like there's a huge power disparity from me or you. So yeah, I'd probably agree to a commission or something in the event that you sold them, if I could bear to part with them.
Terrific. So that allows me much better insight. And I know this is being recorded, so I could watch it again. I appreciate your answers to those questions. I hope that I did justice to yours and have explained my position to your satisfaction. Is there anything you feel I'm copping out on?
Well, before Brent jumps in, I want to ask you a question. So we kind of touched on this a little bit. You said you don't really object to the idea of like intergenerational accumulation of wealth. But let's consider for the second that wealth inequalities are growing bigger and bigger. And as more jobs are automated and AI advances, and that automation is going to cover like a bigger and bigger area of the job market, and potentially new jobs won't take all those old jobs places like they have historically. So what do we do in that situation where there's not even work for people to take?
So we'll first assume that that's going to happen. We have more automation now than ever before, and we have an extremely low unemployment rate. What is the cause of that? Well, we can get into that, but I'm not sure that's necessarily something that's going to happen. If it did, we would get the Peter Josephs and the Mark Passios of the world and have them explain the gift economy to us, people from the Venus Project. So we could engage in any sort of interaction that would yield us maximum results, so long as we don't initiate violence doing it. That is my answer. I mean, the fact that I would know how 7 billion people, how they would respond to losing jobs if they wouldn't come up with more ideas, how much wealth it would yield, I really have no clue. But that is the best justice I could try to do to that answer.
And so what do you think about, for example, the trucking industry might completely change along with a bunch of other industries in the near future. And even if new types of jobs replace those in the long run, in the short run, there's going to be huge disruption. So how do we resolve that? We just say that everyone just has to find their own way and hope that other people are generous and help them out, or what?
The only way I know, I have no clue what those, what is it, 9 or 10 million truck drivers? I have no clue what their skills are, what they could do in exchange, what money or resources they have access to, what their values are. That's why I sort of apophatically claim my position as the non-initiation of force. I don't know what people should do because I haven't met them. I don't know who their neighbors are. I don't know what satisfies them. I don't know what they value. So my position to something like that would be when people came home from, I would mainly want there to be a totally government regulated economy so we could have as much innovation, voluntary exchange, as many ideas floating and exchanging as possible. Whether it includes money or not, I'm totally open to that. As far as World War II, all the Keynesians basically said this is going to suck. We've gone from enslaving people through the draft. They're going to come home. There's going to be no unemployment. They'll just sit around. I don't think that necessarily happens. I think that, like many other things, is a fear mechanism that's used to get people to say, I can't think of how X will be solved, therefore the state should violently intervene. I believe it's a logical fallacy, so I don't know what should happen.
It's actually already happening. It's there's tons of people, factories have left towns and the people are unemployed. That's why there's a spike in drug addiction. That's at least part of the reason. And depression and suicide. This is all already happening.
So in America,
not hypothetical. In
America, we had 80% of people employed in agriculture in 1760. Now we have 2%. Mm-hmm. It doesn't yield a 78% unemployment rate. I don't know what the solution is. What I do know is you should not initiate violence against those people looking for a job or ways to earn money. And you shouldn't initiate violence against anyone trying to employ them or exchange with them. I can't tell you how people are going to solve this crisis. I mean, we went from agriculture to industrial to technology to information. I have no clue what jobs are going to hold. I have no clue what products there's going to be. I have no clue what productivity levels will be. Just don't initiate violence. Respect people's individuality and allow them to pursue their goals and solve that problem themselves. Not every man for himself, but any cooperation must be voluntary. I'm all for cooperation. That's why I'm against the state.
Okay, I'll say one last thing, and then I'll let you guys both say your final piece, and then we'll just wrap it up. So the main disagreement here, I think, there's a couple, but the main one, I think, is you're basically treating the non-aggression principle as the hill you're going to die on no matter what. Whereas, like my view, I'm more of a utilitarianist, and I think Brent is also more consequences minded. And until like that disagreement is resolved a little more, I think the fundamental distinction or disagreement remains. And then there's also some disagreement about when force is being initiated and property rights and stuff like that. But anyway,
but Sean, let's say the Catholic Church does not forcibly prearrange marriages. Who are people going to marry, and what how many children are they going to have?
Well, hang on, because I think we are running kind of low on time, and you had asked me if I thought you were missing some things. So could I respond to that really quickly? Yeah.
My point is I don't know what people do in the absence of violence. All I'm saying is there should not be violence, whether it's by the state, the slave owner, the Catholic Church, any group of people. That's why I'm an anarchist.
Yeah. I will say, I will quote an old English teacher of mine, should is a very dangerous word. There's two kind of issues, and actually, Steve, you kind of put them both front and center because I wanted to talk about them. Oh, Sean. Why did I call you Steve?
Steve,
sorry. All right, Sean. The first thing that I think you may want to examine in the future, Keith, is there's two parts of your worldview that I think are philosophically suspect. And they are actually both the non-aggression principle and the idea of self-ownership. To begin with the non-aggression principle, I think that principle is actually ethically broken. And I think it's broken for the very simple fact that aggression is a subjective thing, as I pointed out with Israel and Palestine. And when aggression is subjective, what happens is when two parties conflict, the winner of that conflict will always be the party who has more power. And as we said, might makes reality. So I think you may want to examine the non-aggression principle in practice as opposed to in theory, because in practice, what the non-aggression principle does is it does not prevent aggression, it excuses the aggression of the stronger party and forbids the aggression of the weaker party. Now, that's issue one. Issue two I'm going to give you to think about after this is the idea of self-ownership. And I think this is a major problem in the West in general, because we are a technological culture and we have this idea of the immortal soul that descends from like Catholicism. So oftentimes people think of themselves, they locate themselves as a little man living somewhere inside their head, operating them like a machine. And what I will tell you about the concept of self-ownership as far as that goes is that actually does a disservice to yourself and to everyone that we live with, because suddenly the body, which we are our body, becomes a possession. Your body is not a toaster. Your body and everyone else's bodies do not exist to be utilized for someone else. It is not a machine. And in fact, Heidegger talked a lot about that, about the process of enframing and how people who think in too much technological terms wind up seeing the world in terms of its utility as opposed to existing for itself. So I think that at the root of a lot of some of the things that you said that I disagree with the most are these two philosophical errors. And because of them, what happens is that you may say some things that you might want to look at and see, examine them through the lens of compassion, through the lens of not necessarily a utilitarian lens, but a lens where you are looking at things not as something to be used, but something to exist and that is inherently valuable. Because in my opinion, human lives and the environment that we live in are inherently valuable, and that's why I said it's probably for the best if you go out into the wilderness and don't do anything. But yeah, those are my two things, and you don't need to answer them now because we'll be here forever, but just think about that.
Sure. I definitely see that when you sort of focus on one thing like the non-aggression principle, you can sort of be blinded to some of the effects. In the same way, I'm trying to think of an example, but the reason I use that Catholic Church example about prearranging marriages is that you don't really know what the best way for people to do something as important as marriage. And look at how horrible marriage is right now. It's like 50% divorce rate. People are committing suicide because they're falling out of love. Kids are growing up without parents who fight in front of them, and yeah,
but it's the best of times, it's the worst of times. Also, keep in mind all that stuff was happening before with marriage. It's just women couldn't leave when they were property. So yeah, divorces might go up, but also a lot of people are escaping bad marriages.
Oh, absolutely. Again, the power dynamic is neutral, costs and benefits.
Yeah, that'd be a fun thing to discuss in the future. Keith, do you have to run, or?
You know what?
Or I'm sorry, not Keith. Sean, do you have to run? Because I know you said 15 minutes.
No, it just Keith had told me beforehand that he has to be done at 3.
Oh, so he does have to run. Okay.
You know what? No, the Waco survivor actually pushed me back a little bit, so I just got a couple more minutes. The
Okay.
non-aggression principle, I do believe, is justified in as far as people still have the best claim to their body, the self-ownership claim, that they're one and the same. I still believe people have the best claim with regards to others. So even though there might be a much more spiritual aspect to it, and I am sort of talking about a dumbed down version of it, I'm only doing that in the sense of I don't know which spiritual mechanism is the best. All I'm saying is what I do know is you should still not initiate violence against peaceful people to allow the Brents of the world to become Buddhists, to allow me to be an atheist, to allow Sean to have these broadcasts and have these conversations.
Did I tell everybody? How'd you know I was a Buddhist? Give it away.
You gave me a video to watch. You sent it.
Oh, the one, the RT interview. Yeah, where I said Antifa is Batman. Okay.
So yeah. I would say that, you know what, I don't have anything else to add that I feel would be productive. I will absolutely consider the non-aggression principle having shortcomings. Again, I look at it just like the marriage thing. There should be no forced marriages. Other than that, I really don't know. But that's the only principle I have regarding marriage. I see it as the difference between rape, slavery, and theft, and trade, lovemaking, and just voluntary work. I see that as the non-aggression principle in its consensual aspect. And that is why I value it so much. I believe consent is the root of morality, simply because I don't know what else is best for other people. And them being self-owners have the right to decide, not anyone else. To make the final decision, I should say. So that is my position. Brent, I got to say, I really appreciated this conversation. You answering my questions and being so open to my answers.
Yeah, absolutely. I really appreciated it too. I'm trying to remember. Did you leave ANCAP v ANCOM debate? I didn't ban you, did I?
No, you didn't.
Okay, because I'm vaguely remembering.
I had gotten so many notifications, and you know what? I think it was a lot of the adult content as far as pornography. I don't know if it was on ANCAP, ANCOM.
Oh, yeah, that was not in our forum. You're talking about the one that was started by the guy we banned for, I forget what it was. He wanted to, he was an idiot. God, his friend of Robert Kruger's, I can't think of his name. But anyway, yeah, no, that's the wrong one. Go to the one, Libertarian v Anarchist, for with like 3,000 subscribers.
But I know that I was definitely involved in ANCAP, ANCOM. I just can't remember the reason I left.
Okay. Yeah, definitely was not pornography.
Oh no, it wasn't. Okay, well that was another group then. But I'm devastated to hear that a group of people like ANCAPs and ANCOMs, these are generally people who have not inherited their ideology. They're people who have sort of sought out and come to conclusions. And to hear that those people are putting up racist stuff or having non-productive discussions, as was the reason I think I just left because I felt it was unproductive. That is devastating. And I appreciate Sean for hosting this so we could sort of combat that and get a better name for the anarchists, anyone who has any incredulity towards those in authority. So
there's a lot of edgelords out there. I'd say this is a thing that we see in anarchism a lot, especially people who newly come to it, if they come through like the right libertarian angle of things. There's an element of, with great power comes no responsibility. And some of the younger ones, it's like they're Peter Parker that never got talked to by Uncle Ben. So.
Yeah, that's funny.
All right. So is that it? Do you guys have any other questions for me, or?
I got nothing else.
Yeah, I mean, considering the time constraints at this point, I think we probably shouldn't get into anything like too deep. So we might as well call it here.
Well, thanks, guys. I will catch you later.
Really appreciate it, gentlemen. Take care.
Ditto.
Bye-bye.